I stood near the back of the conference hall, a space I had helped lay out a decade ago, my hands clasped behind me in a familiar posture of observation. Now it felt like a stranger's house. 250 employees of Sterling Manufacturing were gathered, their faces a carefully composed mural of manufactured enthusiasm and deeply held anxiety. They were all here for the new CEO's first big address. His name was Julian Sterling Jr., and he was about to unveil his vision. I knew most of the people here. I knew Maria from accounting was worried about her son's college tuition. I knew Dave from logistics was a grandfather for the third time. I had hired dozens of them. I had mentored more. For 32 years, this place wasn't just a job. It was my world. My name is Arthur Finch, and at 55 years old, I was the company's head of operations. I was supposed to be part of the bedrock, as solid and immovable as the building's foundation. Julian strode onto the stage with a practiced, fluid ease that didn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders. He was all sharp angles. A crisp, dark suit that probably cost more than my first car, a severe haircut that looked like it had been done with a laser, and a smile that never, ever reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was the founder's son, but the resemblance ended with his last name. His father, Julian S.R., was a man of the factory floor. He could diagnose a problem with a stamping press just by the rhythm of its clang. He smelled of machine oil and strong coffee. He knew his people. Julian Jr. smelled of an expensive, citrusy cologne and only knew spreadsheets. He launched into his speech, his voice amplified by the microphone, filling the cold room with a cascade of empty, prepackaged words. He spoke of synergy and disruption and leveraging our core competencies into a new paradigm. He used the word legacy at least 10 times, but it was clear he was talking about the one he intended to build upon the ashes of his fathers, not the one his father had so carefully constructed. With every meaningless buzzword, the knot in my stomach pulled a little tighter. I had seen this coming, of course. Not this exact moment, not this public stage, but the event itself. It had been in the small, almost imperceptible shifts. The executive meetings I was suddenly no longer invited to, with flimsy excuses about scheduling conflicts. The new team of young, hungry consultants who looked at me like I was a piece of antique furniture, valuable once but now just taking up space. The casual, cutting way Julian would say in meetings, "We need some fresh blood in here, some new thinking," while his eyes would flicker in my direction for a fraction of a second. I just never imagined he would have the audacity, the sheer cruelty, to do it like this. He clicked to the final slide of his PowerPoint presentation, a ridiculously optimistic graph with an arrow pointing straight to the heavens. Then he paused, a showman's trick, letting the silence hang in the air. The empty smile widened a fraction. "As we move into this exciting new era," he announced, his voice booming with a false, unearned authority, "we have to make some difficult but necessary changes to our leadership structure. We need to be lean, we need to be agile, we need to be hungry." His eyes scanned the crowd, a predator looking for the weakest member of the herd to make an example of, and then they found me. He locked his gaze onto mine, holding it for a long, deliberate moment. It was a power play, a clear and brutal message to everyone watching. "Our future will be led by my new Chief of Innovation, a role I am thrilled to announce will be filled by my son, Kyle Sterling." A wave of confused, angry murmurs washed over the room. Kyle was 23 years old. His primary qualification for the role was his last name. His experience consisted of a single summer internship where he spent most of his time trying to convince the board to invest the company's pension fund in a cryptocurrency scheme he'd read about on the internet. Then Julian delivered the final, fatal blow. "This restructuring also means we are saying goodbye to some of the old guard. They helped us get here, and we thank them for their service." He never said my name. He didn't have to. In that silent, cavernous room, every single head turned to look at me. I could feel their eyes on my skin, a physical weight of pity from some, fear from others. It was a public execution. He was severing the past from the future, and he had cast me as the symbol of that past, a sacrificial lamb on the altar of his own ambition. He was telling them all that loyalty, the currency his father had built this company on, was now worthless in his new empire. The speech ended. A few people clapped, the sound thin and uncertain in the heavy, shocked air. I stood there frozen, the blood roaring in my ears like a freight train. Marcus Vance, our head of HR, a man whose spine was made of jelly, suddenly materialized at my elbow. "Arthur," he said, his voice a low, nervous murmur, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder, completely unable to look at me. If you'll follow me." I didn't trust myself to speak. 1,000 furious replies died on my tongue. I just gave a single, curt nod. I followed him, walking past the rows of my colleagues, my friends. My office, my second home for more than 3 decades, had already been violated. A single, flimsy cardboard box sat on my desk, a pathetic, insulting summary of a life's work. My favorite coffee mug, a picture of my wife, Sarah, smiling at me from a beach vacation, a framed award for service from Julian's father that now felt like a cruel, twisted joke. He hadn't even granted me the basic human dignity of packing my own memories. He wanted me gone, erased, as if I had never mattered at all. The walk from my office to the main exit was the longest and most humiliating journey of my life. Each step echoed on the polished floor, a slow, mournful drumbeat marking the end of an era. The building I had helped expand, the hallways I had walked thousands of times, now felt alien and hostile, the walls themselves seemed to recoil from my presence. I clutched the box to my chest, its sharp cardboard corners digging into my ribs. It felt so light, so insubstantial, as if it might fall apart at any moment, just like the life I had so carefully built. People saw me coming. The sound of keyboards, the normal rhythm of the office, would suddenly fall silent as I approached a new section of cubicles. Some people I had known for years, would quickly turn their heads, suddenly fascinated by a spreadsheet on their computer screen. I understood. Fear is a powerful and primal instinct. Julian had just made a very public display of what happened to those who were no longer deemed useful. A few, the brave ones, the ones with a little bit of his father's steel still in them, met my gaze. Maria from accounting, a woman I had helped navigate the company's insurance bureaucracy when her husband was sick. Tears welled in her eyes, a silent testament to shared history. Dave from logistics, we had started in the mailroom together on the same rainy Monday 32 years ago. He just shook his head slowly, his face a grim mask of disgust and utter helplessness. Their silent support was a small, flickering candle in a vast, encroaching darkness. I reached the gleaming glass doors of the lobby. Outside, the world was carrying on as if nothing monumental had just happened. The sun was bright, casting long afternoon shadows. Cars streamed by on the street, a river of oblivious commuters. People hurried along the sidewalk, talking on their phones, laughing, living their lives. Inside, my life had just been systematically demolished. I saw my reflection in the glass. A man of 55, more gray at the temples than I remembered, wearing a suit that suddenly felt like a costume from a play that had just ended. The security guard, Tom, a young man whose wife had just had a baby, a fact I knew because I had asked him about it just last week, had to buzz me out. His face was flushed with embarrassment. "Sorry, Mr. Finch," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the button on the console, refusing to look at me. It was the first time in over 30 years I needed permission to leave the building I had helped build. I got into my car. It was an older sedan, reliable, practical, paid for, much like I used to think I was. I placed the box on the passenger seat. The framed picture of Sarah had fallen over, her smiling face now hidden from view. I just sat there in the parking spot that had been designated for me for decades and stared at the monolithic building. I watched people trickle out, their shoulders hunched, their faces grim. Julian's message had been received loud and clear. Nobody was safe. I don't know how long I sat there, an hour, maybe 2. The sun began its slow, painful descent, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple that mirrored the turmoil in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to turn the key in the ignition. Driving home meant it was real. Driving home meant facing Sarah's worried eyes. My phone buzzed relentlessly in my pocket. Sarah, my son Mark, a few close friends who had undoubtedly already heard the news through the corporate grapevine. I couldn't answer. What could I possibly say? How do you put words to this feeling? The feeling of being hollowed out, of being told that your entire professional life, your expertise, your dedication, your loyalty was worth less than nothing. Finally, my hands moved on their own, a reflex born of decades of commuting. I started the car. The drive home was a blur of familiar streets that now looked completely foreign. I went on autopilot, my mind a chaotic, raging storm of shock, humiliation, and a white-hot anger that was still too new to have a name. When I pulled into my driveway, the knot in my stomach was so tight I thought I was going to be physically sick. The front door opened before I could even turn off the engine. Sarah came running out, her face a canvas of pure, unadulterated worry. She saw the box in my hands. She didn't need to ask a single question. Her beautiful face crumpled, and she wrapped her arms around me right there in the driveway, holding me up as my knees threatened to buckle. I buried my face in her shoulder, the familiar scent of her perfume a small anchor in a world that had come unmoored. And the cold, rigid control I had maintained all afternoon finally shattered into a million pieces. The humiliation, the betrayal, and the deep, silent rage washed over me in a tidal wave. The days that followed were a gray, shapeless, suffocating fog. My body, a creature of relentless habit, would wake me at 6 a.m. sharp. For a single blessed, merciful second, everything would feel normal. I'd start thinking about the morning production meeting, about the complex logistics of the new product launch, about the shipment from Germany that needed to be tracked. Then reality would crash down on me like a physical weight, pinning me to the bed. There was nowhere to go. There were no problems to solve, no team to lead. I was a man adrift in the middle of a vast, empty, silent ocean. Sarah was my anchor in that storm. She tried everything. She made my favorite meals, rich stews and hearty pastas, which I would stare at, the food turning to ash in my mouth. She suggested we take a trip, pull out the old maps, and plan a vacation to the mountains. She would sit with me for hours in the quiet living room, not saying much, just being there, her presence a silent testament to a loyalty that was real and unconditional. But I was a ghost in my own home, a prisoner locked inside my own head, replaying that horrible, degrading scene in the conference hall on an endless, torturous loop. Julian's smug, triumphant face. The pity and fear in my coworkers' eyes. The cold, final, metallic click of the lobby door locking me out forever. The severance package arrived by courier a few days later. It was a slap in the face. The bare legal minimum, an amount so small it was laughable, wrapped in 20 pages of dense, threatening non-disclosure and non-compete agreements. It was hush money, an insult designed to make me crawl away quietly and disappear. A part of me, the proud, angry part that still flickered with life, wanted to fight, to call a lawyer, to scream from the rooftops about the injustice, to sue them for blatant age discrimination. But the weary, realistic part of me knew it was a fool's errand. Sterling Manufacturing had an army of lawyers on a multi-million-dollar retainer. They would drag it out for years, burying me in motions and legal fees, all while Julian watched with detached amusement. He wanted to break my spirit completely. I couldn't give him that final satisfaction. I retreated to the garage. It became my sanctuary, the one place where I felt a sliver of control. I spent hours organizing tools that were already perfectly organized, fixing things that weren't broken. The familiar feel of wood and steel in my hands, a small comfort. Anything to keep my hands and mind occupied. After about a week of this self-imposed exile, Sarah came out holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Her expression was a familiar, potent blend of deep love and profound exasperation. "Arthur, you can't hide out here forever," she said gently, her voice cutting through the fog in my head. "This isn't you." She paused, then added, "You know, your parents' old things are still in the attic. We've been meaning to clear that out for years. Maybe it's a good project, something to focus on, a way to move forward." She was right. I needed a project. I needed to do something that had a clear beginning and a definite end. The attic was hot and stuffy and smelled of dust, old paper, and a century of trapped memories. It was a time capsule of a simple, well-lived life. Boxes of old, curled photographs, my mother's wedding dress sealed in a yellowed plastic bag, my father's old fishing gear, my entire childhood packed away in dusty boxes. It was painful being up there, surrounded by their memory, feeling like I had let them down, that I had failed to live up to their example of strength and resilience. I was sorting through a stack of old, musty wool blankets when my hand hit something hard, cold, and metallic. A box. It was an old, heavy, dark green strongbox, the kind people used to keep their most important papers and valuables in. It was tucked away far under the eaves, behind a stack of old suitcases, deliberately hidden from casual view. It was locked. I dragged it out into the single beam of light filtering through the dusty attic window. It was heavy, solid, a relic from another time. Rust bloomed at its corners like a strange, orange moss. I couldn't remember ever seeing it before in my life. I shook it. Something inside shifted with a soft, muffled, intriguing thud. An irrational, almost manic curiosity took hold of me. I spent the next hour rummaging through my dad's old toolboxes, trying every old key on my own keychains. Nothing worked. The frustration mounted with every failed attempt. It was just a stupid box. It probably held nothing more than old, expired insurance policies and duplicate birth certificates. but it became an obsession. It was a lock I could pick. It was a problem I could solve. Then a faint memory surfaced, my mother's old jewelry box. I scrambled down the attic ladder and found it in the back of Sarah's closet. It was a beautiful mahogany box with a mother-of-pearl inlay. In a hidden, felt-lined compartment under the main tray, I found it. A small, ornate brass key. It looked ancient, like something out of a fairy tale. My hand was shaking as I carried it back up the ladder to the attic. I knelt in front of the strongbox, the dust motes dancing in the air around me like tiny, silent witnesses. I slid the key into the lock. It was a perfect, snug fit. I turned it. With a loud, deeply satisfying click that echoed in the silent attic, the lock sprang open. I took a deep, shuddering breath, lifted the heavy lid, my heart pounding in my chest for a reason I couldn't possibly explain. And there it was. The first thing I saw, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was not a pile of money or jewelry. It was a single, thick, sealed envelope. On the front, in my mother's beautiful, elegant, and instantly recognizable handwriting, was my name, Arthur. Before I tell you what was in that letter, you have to understand Henry and Clara Finch. You have to understand the very air I breathed as a child. In our small, modest house, loyalty wasn't just a word you said at church. It was the foundation. It was the walls. It was the unwavering principle that governed our lives. My father, Henry, went to work at the Pendleton textile mill every single morning for 40 years. 40 years. He never once called in sick. He packed the exact same lunch every day, a turkey sandwich on rye bread, a crisp red delicious apple, and a small, dented steel thermos of black coffee. He believed in a simple, unbreakable, almost sacred contract. You gave your employer your best effort, you gave them your time, you gave them your unwavering word, and in return they would take care of you. It was the central, unshakable principle of his world. I have this vivid memory of being a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, watching him come home every evening. He would walk through the door, his hands calloused and stained with dye, his body weary from a long, loud day at the machines, but his spirit was never broken. He was proud of his work. He was proud that he could provide for his family with the labor of his own 2 hands. Then when I was in my early 20s, just starting out at Sterling, the mill shut its doors for good. The owners, a faceless corporation from out of state, moved the entire operation overseas to save a few dollars an hour on labor. 40 years of unwavering, back-breaking loyalty, and they gave him a final paycheck and a polite, impersonal handshake. It shattered something deep inside him, not his work ethic, not his integrity, but his profound faith in that simple, honest contract. He never complained about it, not once, but I saw the bright, steady light in his eyes dim. He felt discarded, like a piece of old machinery that was no longer useful. It was the first time I truly understood that the world I was about to enter was a place where that sacred contract could be broken without a second thought, without a shred of guilt. My mother, Clara, was the quiet, steady, unshakable heart of our family. She managed the household finances with the meticulous precision of a master watchmaker. Every single penny was accounted for in her little black ledger. She could make a dollar stretch further than anyone I've ever known. She taught me to value things not by their price tag, but by their quality, their craftsmanship, and their durability. "Never buy cheap shoes, Arthur," she would say, inspecting a new pair I'd bought for school. "A man is judged by the quality of his shoes and the strength of his word." It was her way of saying that character, quality, and substance mattered infinitely more than flash and fleeting style. When I landed my first real job at Sterling Manufacturing, my parents were immensely proud. Back then, it was a true family company, an extension of the community. Julian Sterling, SR, was a man cut from the same sturdy cloth as my father. He'd started on the factory floor himself, sweeping up metal shavings. He knew the business from the ground up. He would walk through the plant every single day, not on a formal, pre-announced tour, but just to talk to people, to ask about their families, to listen to their concerns. He saw potential in me, a young kid from the mailroom. He promoted me, mentored me, invested in me. "You're built on solid ground, Arthur," he told me once after I had stayed up all night to solve a critical production problem. "You're loyal. In the end, when all the dust settles, that's the most valuable thing a man can be." That was the Sterling Manufacturing I gave my life to, the one built on handshakes and mutual trust. The one where loyalty was a two-way street, a bond forged in shared purpose. I watched Julian Jr. grow up from a distance. He was a spoiled, petulant boy who had everything handed to him on a silver platter. He never spent a single summer working the line, getting his hands dirty. He never learned the business from the inside out. He went off to some fancy, expensive business school where they taught him that employees weren't people, they were human capital. They were assets on a balance sheet to be managed, manipulated, and when necessary, liquidated for a better return on investment. He saw his father's way of doing things, his focus on people and community, as sentimental, inefficient, and obsolete. He saw men like me as dinosaurs, relics of a dead and buried era, just waiting for the meteor of progress to come and wipe us out. And as I stood in my hot, dusty attic about to open that faded letter, I realized with a chilling certainty that his meteor had finally, irrevocably, hit. I remember a night about 15 years ago, a night of fire and chaos. The call came at 2 in the morning, a frantic voice on the other end of the line. A fire had broken out in the main warehouse. I was there before the second fire truck even arrived, its siren wailing in the distance. The scene was pure, terrifying chaos. Thick, black, acrid smoke poured into the night sky, illuminated from below by the furious orange flames that were licking at the warehouse roof. Julian Sr. was there, his face streaked with soot and despair, watching decades of his life's work go up in flames. The fire chief, a grim-faced man with tired eyes, was adamant. The roof was unstable. A whole section was about to collapse. It was too dangerous for his men to go inside. But I knew that warehouse better than I knew my own home. I knew every corner, every shortcut, every hidden space. More importantly, I knew that a specific, large shipment of highly flammable industrial chemicals was stored right in the path of the advancing fire. If the flames reached it, the explosion could take out half the plant, maybe more. While everyone else stood back, helpless, a memory surfaced from the deep recesses of my mind. An old, forgotten access tunnel, one that wasn't on any of the official, modern blueprints. It was a service corridor from the original construction, long since sealed off but not demolished. I ran to Julian Sr. and quickly, breathlessly explained my plan. He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze searching and intense in the flickering firelight. He saw the conviction there. He saw I wasn't being reckless, I was being surgical. He just nodded, his face a mask of grim determination. "Be safe, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I went in. The heat was a physical blow, and the smoke was so thick I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. But my feet knew the way, every turn, every dip in the concrete floor. I found the chemicals. I managed to get the manual sprinkler system in that specific sector working, a torrent of blessed, cold water. Then, using a nearby forklift, its engine roaring in the inferno, I moved the most dangerous pallets out of the fire's destructive path. It was risky. It was probably foolish. But we saved the plant. The fire was contained. The next day, Julian Sr. called a full assembly of the entire staff. He stood on a makeshift stage of wooden pallets and put his heavy arm around my shoulder. "This man," he said, his voice booming with pride and gratitude, "is the heartbeat of this company. He's got sterling steel in his spine." That was the proudest, most defining moment of my entire career. Years later, Julian Jr., fresh out of business school and wearing a suit that cost more than my first car, came for a formal inspection of the plant. He walked right past me in the hallway, his eyes sliding over me as if I were part of the wall. Later, in a management meeting, he openly and condescendingly questioned one of my logistical decisions. "The data models suggest a more aggressive approach to inventory management, Arthur," he said, not looking at me but at the glowing charts and graphs on his laptop screen. I tried to explain the human element, the decades-long, trust-based relationships we had with our suppliers, a form of goodwill that couldn't be quantified in one of his precious spreadsheets. "These are people we've worked with for 30 years, Julian," I explained patiently. "They help us out in a pinch. They give us priority when things get tight. That's worth more than a few percentage points on a data model." He gave a small, dismissive, condescending smirk. "And that's the problem, Arthur. We're running a 21st century business, not a 19th century friendship club." He completely, utterly dismissed my 3 decades of experience. He saw my loyalty to our partners as a quaint, sentimental weakness, a vulnerability to be exploited, not nurtured. It was the first time I realized, with a cold, sinking feeling in my stomach, that we didn't just see the company differently. We saw the entire world differently. He saw people as disposable, interchangeable tools. I saw them as partners. His father had seen them as family. The day Julian SR retired was a sad, gray day for the company. He was tired. The business had grown too complex, he said, too fast. He was handing the reins over to his son. At his retirement party, a stiff, formal affair, he pulled me aside, away from the polite applause and the clinking of champagne glasses. He gripped my arm, his knuckles white and bony. "Look after the place for me, Arthur," he said, his voice low and urgent, his eyes pleading. "Look after my people, Julian. He's smart, I'll give him that, but he's got some hard, painful lessons to learn. You keep him grounded. You're the conscience of this place now." It felt like he was passing a sacred, heavy torch to me. A final, desperate request from a man who knew his legacy was in jeopardy. At that same party, Julian Jr. gave a slick, polished, and utterly soulless speech, full of hollow promises about honoring his father's legacy while simultaneously taking the company to new, unprecedented heights. He even turned to me on the stage and smiled that empty, plastic smile. "And of course, we'll continue to rely on the wisdom and the steady guidance of my father's most trusted lieutenant, Arthur Finch. Your family, Arthur." The words were smooth and empty, like polished river stones. They felt hollow and false even then. The changes started slowly, insidiously, like a poison being dripped into the company's water supply. He brought in his own people, a team of young, ambitious, jargon-spouting consultants who spoke a strange and alien language of optimization and downsizing. They walked the halls with their iPads and their cold, calculating eyes, judging everyone, measuring their worth in metrics and key performance indicators. Long-term, loyal employees, the ones with decades of priceless, irreplaceable institutional knowledge, started getting pushed into early retirement. They were replaced by younger, cheaper graduates who knew how to make a dazzling PowerPoint presentation but didn't know the first thing about our products, our history, or our customers. The company culture, once built on mutual respect and a shared, powerful sense of purpose, began to curdle and rot from the inside out. It became a place of fear, suspicion, and paranoia. People stopped talking and laughing in the hallways. Everyone was worried about their job, looking over their shoulder. Productivity, the real, tangible kind, went down, but in a bizarre and perverse twist of Wall Street logic, the company's stock price went up on the news of all the efficiencies. Julian Jr. was hailed as a visionary, a genius in the business papers. I tried to talk to him. I tried again and again to uphold the promise I had made to his father. I warned him that he was cutting out the heart and soul of the company just to make the numbers look good for the next quarterly report. He would listen with that same patient, condescending smile, nod his head as if he were taking my words seriously, and then do exactly what he had planned to do anyway. "I appreciate your perspective, Arthur," he'd say, the words dripping with a dismissal that was more insulting than any outright argument. "It's valuable to know how things used to be done." The condescension was a sharp, twisting knife in my gut. He made me feel like a fossil, a relic of a dead and buried age, a walking, talking anachronism. I remember complaining to my own dad about it one evening, not long before he passed away. He had been through his own bitter experience with forced retirement from the mill years earlier. He listened patiently, as he always did, his head cocked to one side, while I vented my growing frustration. Then he put his heavy, calloused, comforting hand on my shoulder. "They can take your job, Artie," he said, using his old, affectionate nickname for me. "They did it to me. They might do it to you one day, but they can't take your name, and they can't take what we built for you." At the time, I thought he was speaking metaphorically. I thought he meant my character, my moral compass, my upbringing. I thought he was telling me to hold on to my integrity, no matter what. Standing there in the hot, dusty attic, holding the cold, brass key to that mysterious strongbox, I started to realize with a sudden, breathtaking clarity that he might have meant something far more literal, far more tangible. He had seen the world change. He had learned the hardest, most brutal lesson of all, that in this new world, loyalty was no longer a shield. And he and my mother had quietly, secretly, and lovingly spent their entire lives forging a new one for me. With hands that felt clumsy and numb, like they belonged to someone else, I lifted the envelope out of the strongbox. The paper was thick, creamy, and old, a heavy, luxurious stock that you don't find anymore. My name on the front, Arthur, written in my mother's perfect, looping cursive, was a beacon from a lost world. I set it aside for a moment on a clean patch of the dusty floorboards, my heart not quite ready for the finality of her words. Underneath there were two other items nestled in the box's faded, dark red velvet lining. One was a small, worn, leather-bound passbook for a savings account at a local credit union I'd never even heard of, the Community First Credit Union. The other was a thick, impressive bundle of official-looking paper stock certificates, held together with a faded, brittle rubber band that looked like it would crumble to dust if I touched it. I picked up the passbook first. The leather was soft and cracked with age, the corners worn smooth from decades of handling. I opened it. The first entry was dated the very month I was born. The deposit was for $5. My mother's neat, precise, almost microscopic handwriting filled the page. And then, every single month, without a single one missed for over 30 years, another entry. Sometimes $5. Sometimes 10. On birthdays or Christmases, there might be a larger entry for 25. It was a relentless, unbroken, beautiful chain of small, consistent sacrifices. I could so clearly and painfully picture my mother, sitting at her small, worn kitchen table, her reading glasses perched on her nose, balancing her budget down to the last penny, and carefully setting aside that small amount for me before anything else. It was a tangible, physical record of her love, her hope, and her unwavering discipline. The last entry was dated just a few weeks before she passed away. The final balance was just over $17,000, a respectable sum, certainly a small cushion, but not a life-changing amount of money. It was the consistency that floored me, the sheer, dogged, heroic dedication over a lifetime. Then, with a sense of reverence, I picked up the stock certificates. The paper was heavy and ornate, with intricate borders and official-looking seals. They were for a company I barely recognized at first, Berkshire Hathaway. The name was vaguely familiar. I knew it was some big, famous investment company run by that legendary old billionaire from Omaha, Warren Buffett. There were only a few certificates, 10 to be exact. I carefully unfolded them, my breath catching in my throat. They were Class A shares. The purchase date was clearly printed, 1982. I had absolutely no idea what they were worth, but they looked important. They felt heavy, not just with the weight of the fine paper, but with the immense, crushing weight of my parents' foresight and love. I sat there on the dusty attic floor for a long, long time, just holding these three objects. The letter, the passbook, the stocks. It was a treasure chest from another time, another world. A time when people planned for generations, not just for the next fiscal quarter. A time when value was something that was built slowly, patiently, brick by brick, year after year. A time when parents saw their most sacred duty not just as feeding and clothing their children, but as trying to build a foundation of security for them that they themselves had never known. The dust motes danced in the single golden beam of light from the attic window, like tiny, silent, glittering ghosts. The house was completely silent. I was alone with the memory of my parents and the incredible, secret, profound legacy they had so painstakingly and secretly built for me. Finally, my hands no longer shaking, I picked up the letter. I carefully broke the brittle wax seal, unfolded the crisp, aged paper, and began to read my mother's words. "My dearest Arthur," the letter began, her handwriting as familiar to me as my own reflection. "If you are reading this, then it means your father and I are gone and you have found the box. I hope with all my heart that you have found it in a time of peace and prosperity, but I have a mother's intuition, a fear that you have found it in a time of need. We have watched you grow into a good and honest man, a loyal man, just like your dear father. And in this new, colder world, Arthur, loyalty can be a dangerous thing. It can be mistaken for weakness by men who have none of their own." I had to stop and take a deep, shuddering breath that felt like it was tearing through my chest. It felt like she was in the room with me, her voice a soft, loving whisper in the dusty air, seeing my current pain with perfect, heartbreaking clarity. "Your father learned this the hard way at the mill," she continued, and I could feel the old, remembered pain in her words. "He gave them his body, his time, his entire life, and they gave him a pink slip and a cold handshake. It was a bitter, cruel lesson, but it was one we learned well. Your father and I, we realized that you cannot place your entire future, your entire sense of self and worth, in the hands of another man, no matter how good or trustworthy he seems to be. A company is not your family, Arthur. It will not love you back. It does not have a heart. So we made a plan, a quiet plan just for you. From the very day you were born, we started saving. The little passbook you see is the fruit of our discipline. A few dollars from every single paycheck, no matter what else we had to do without. It was our emergency fund for you, a small shield against the storms of life. But we knew that just saving wasn't enough. The world of money was changing in ways we barely understood. Your father didn't understand all the complicated details, but he trusted me. I read everything I could get my hands on at the public library. I read about this man in Omaha, this Mr. Buffett. He wasn't a gambler. He didn't chase fads or trends. He invested. He bought into good, honest, well-run American companies and he held on. He believed in value. He believed in patience. In a way, with his simple, straightforward talk, he reminded me of your father. So, with a little money we had from my own mother's small inheritance, money we had tucked away for years, we bought a few of his company's shares. It felt like a fortune to us back then. A huge, terrifying, reckless risk. But I had a feeling deep in my bones, Arthur. This was not a bet, it was a belief. A belief in the very same values we tried so hard to teach you. Work hard, be honest, be patient, and let time do its quiet, relentless, magical work. This is your safety net, Arthur. This is your freedom. Use it to protect yourself. Use it to build something of your own, something that no one can ever take away from you. Or use it to simply live a good life, free from the kind of gnawing, sleepless worry that haunted us for so many years. We did not build this for you so you could be a rich man. We built this for you so you could always be your own man. So that no one, no arrogant boss, no faceless company could ever take your dignity from you. That is the one thing in this world you have to own for yourself. We love you more than words can ever say. We are so very, very proud of the man you became. Now go and be that man on your own terms. All our love. Mom and Dad. I finished the letter and the tears I had been holding back since that horrible day in the conference room finally came, a hot, silent, cleansing flood. They weren't tears of sadness or grief. They were tears of overwhelming, crushing, profound gratitude, and of a deep, solid understanding that settled into the very marrow of my bones. My parents had seen the future. They had lived through the trauma and the betrayal of my father's layoff and had spent the rest of their lives building a secret, powerful shield to protect me from the same wound. They hadn't left me a fortune. They had left me a choice. They had left me independence. The $17,000 in the passbook was the tangible proof of their discipline. The letter was the priceless gift of their wisdom. And the stock certificates were the embodiment of their power. I still had no concrete idea of what they were worth, but I knew in that quiet, dusty, sacred moment that Julian Sterling Jr., in his infinite arrogance, had made the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of his entire life. He hadn't just fired some old, loyal, obsolete employee. He had fired a man whose parents had just armed him for war from beyond the grave. The next morning I woke up a different person. The gray, suffocating fog of depression had burned away in the night, replaced by a cold, clear, sharp sense of purpose that felt like a blade of ice in my chest. I got dressed not in one of my old, baggy, defeated-looking suits, but in a simple pair of well-pressed gray trousers and a crisp white shirt. I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't see a victim staring back at me anymore. I saw Henry Finch's son. I saw Clara Finch's son. And I saw a glimmer of the man they had believed I could be. I made an appointment with a financial advisory firm downtown. Not one of the big, flashy, glass tower firms with a famous name, but a small, established, discreet office that had been on the same quiet, tree-lined street for 50 years. It felt like the kind of solid, unpretentious place my mother would have chosen. I sat in a comfortable, worn leather chair across from a man named Mr. Chen, a kind-eyed man in his late 60s with a calm, reassuring, professional demeanor. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. I simply opened my old leather briefcase and placed the thick bundle of stock certificates on his polished mahogany desk. He picked them up carefully with a reverence that surprised me, handling them as if they were fragile historical documents. He put on a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses and examined them, one by one. His eyebrows shot up, disappearing into his hairline. He looked at me, a flicker of profound disbelief in his eyes, then back at the certificates. He walked over to his computer, his movements suddenly brisk and energized. He typed for a few minutes, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The only sound in the quiet, wood-paneled office was the soft, rhythmic clicking of the keys. He let out a low, slow, almost musical whistle. He turned back to me, his expression a carefully controlled mixture of profound shock and professional awe. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid of spooking a wild animal, "do you have any idea what you have here?" I shook my head, my own heart starting to pound against my ribs. "I have a rough idea of when they were purchased, the early 80s, but that's all I know." He took off his glasses and slowly, deliberately polished them with a silk handkerchief. It was a gesture designed to give himself a moment to compose his thoughts. "Mr. Finch, these are Berkshire Hathaway Class A shares. In the early 1980s, they were worth a few $100s a share. A very significant and wise investment for an ordinary family, to be sure. Today, Mr. Finch, each one of these individual shares is worth well over $500,000. The air went out of my lungs in a sudden, violent rush. It felt like I had been punched in the chest. I did the math in my head, my mind struggling to keep up with the cascading zeros. My parents had bought 10 shares. 10. I was sitting on a portfolio worth somewhere north of $5 million. The number was so large it felt unreal, an abstraction. $5 million. It was more money than my parents had earned in their entire lifetimes of hard, unrelenting work combined. Mr. Chen went on to explain the quiet, beautiful miracle of compound interest. How that initial brave investment had grown and multiplied and split and grown again over 4 long decades. A quiet testament to patience, discipline, and foresight. While I had been dutifully, loyally, naively climbing the corporate ladder at Sterling, my parents' secret legacy had been building its own silent, unstoppable empire. I walked out of that office in a complete and utter daze. The city streets seemed brighter, the noise of the traffic less jarring, almost musical. I wasn't just financially secure. I was powerful. My first overwhelming instinct was pure, unadulterated joy. A great weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. I could pay off the house. I could pay off my kids' crushing student loans. Sarah and I could travel the world, see all the places we had only ever dreamed of seeing in the pages of National Geographic. We could just disappear and live a life of quiet, blissful, well-deserved comfort, leaving Julian Sterling and his toxic, cruel world far, far behind in the rearview mirror. And for a few wonderful, intoxicating hours, that was the plan. I went home and told Sarah. We cried, we laughed until our sides ached. We opened a bottle of expensive champagne we had been saving for a special occasion that had never seemed to come. It felt like we had won the lottery. But as the initial dizzying euphoria began to wear off, as the champagne bubbles faded, something else began to bubble up from a deep, dark place inside me. A slow, cold, and heavy anger. Yes, I could just walk away, but would that be justice? Julian had publicly humiliated me. He had declared me worthless in front of everyone I knew and respected. He had cast me aside like a piece of broken, useless machinery. If I just disappeared, he would win. He would see it as proof that I was weak, that I had run away with my tail between my legs. My mother's words, her final instructions, echoed in my head. We built this for you so you could always be your own man. Being my own man didn't mean running away. It meant standing my ground. It meant fighting back, not on his terms. On mine, this money wasn't an escape route. It was ammunition, and I was finally ready to go to war. That evening, long after Sarah had gone to bed, I sat down at my old, scarred wooden desk in the study. The house was silent. I took out a blank legal pad and a smooth, black fountain pen, my father's old Parker. The question was no longer if I should do something, but what precisely I should do. A lawsuit was still definitively off the table. That was a direct, noisy, brutish confrontation. It was a messy, public battle that would drain my energy and a good portion of my newfound resources. Julian would relish that kind of fight. He thrived on conflict and attrition. He would use his army of slick, soulless lawyers to paint me as a disgruntled, bitter old man, unable to accept the new realities of the modern business world. No, my response had to be the absolute opposite of Julian's brutish style. It couldn't be loud, it had to be quiet, it had to be strategic, it had to be utterly devastating. It had to be the kind of elegant, intricate plan my mother, with her meticulously balanced ledgers, would have appreciated. It had to be built on patience, superior knowledge, and a complete, cold-blooded understanding of my enemy's most critical weaknesses. Julian's greatest weakness was his monumental arrogance. It was a blinding, all-consuming force. He genuinely believed he was the smartest person in every room. He dismissed the past as irrelevant, a collection of quaint and foolish mistakes. He dismissed the old guard, the people who had built the company, as incompetent and obsolete. He believed the entire history of Sterling manufacturing before his glorious arrival was nothing more than a long, boring prelude to his own genius. And in that arrogance and that blindness lay the seeds of his inevitable downfall. He didn't value the company's real assets, the deep, long-term, trust-based relationships that his father and I had spent decades carefully, painstakingly building and nurturing. He saw our suppliers not as vital partners, but as faceless vendors to be squeezed for every last penny. He saw our oldest, most loyal customers not as the bedrock of the company, but as legacy accounts to be milked dry before being discarded. I knew Sterling manufacturing inside and out. I knew it better than any man alive. I knew its strengths, but more importantly, I knew its hidden, secret vulnerabilities. I knew which small, unassuming supplier was most critical to their main production line. I knew which major, high-volume client represented their biggest single source of revenue, the one they couldn't afford to lose. I knew where all the skeletons were buried in the corporate closets because, for years, I was the one who had been tasked with keeping them there. A plan began to form in my mind, not in a sudden flash of inspiration, but slowly, methodically, like a master chess player mapping out the next 20 moves. I wouldn't attack Sterling Manufacturing directly. That would only hurt the hundreds of good, hardworking people still employed there, people who were my friends and neighbors. I wouldn't attack Julian personally, not at first. That would be too obvious, too crude, too satisfying for him. Instead, I would patiently and methodically acquire the very things he needed to survive. I would control his supply chain. I would own his biggest client's loyalty. I would become the invisible gravitational force that held his entire fragile, teetering empire in my hands. And then, when the moment was just right, when all the pieces were perfectly in place, I would simply and quietly squeeze. I spent the next 2 weeks in a whirlwind of focused, purposeful activity. I met with Mr. Chen and a team of sharp, aggressive corporate lawyers he recommended. We set up a new corporation, a holding company. We gave it the most bland, forgettable, anonymous name we could possibly think of. Finch Holdings. I liquidated one of the 10 Berkshire Hathaway shares. The wire transfer to my new corporate bank account was for a sum so large it looked like a phone number. It felt strange and a little sacrilegious to sell something my parents had held onto for so long, but I knew with an absolute and unwavering certainty that I was using it exactly as they would have wanted. I was using it to reclaim my dignity. I was no longer Arthur Finch, the discarded manager. I was Arthur Finch, the investor, and my first major investment was going to be in a very specific and very personal kind of justice. My first target was a company called Precision Components, Inc. It was a small, unassuming, family-owned business run by a man named Frank Miller. Frank's father had started the company in his garage with a single lathe at the exact same time Julian Sterling Sr. was starting his own business in a rented warehouse. They had been partners through thick and thin, recessions and booms for 50 years. Precision Components manufactured a custom-designed, patented gearing mechanism that was absolutely essential for Sterling's flagship product line. It was a small but vital piece of engineering. There was no other supplier in the world who could make it to their exact, demanding, and proprietary specifications. They were, in short, the linchpin of Sterling's entire operation, the one component without which everything else would grind to a halt. I knew from my final miserable year at Sterling that Julian Jr. had been squeezing Frank relentlessly. He had unilaterally and arrogantly extended Sterling's payment terms from the standard 30 days to a crippling, almost bankrupting 90 days. He was demanding annual price cuts and constantly threatening to take the business to a cheaper overseas manufacturer. We both knew it was a hollow, cynical bluff. The quality from an overseas source would be abysmal, the failure rate would be catastrophic, and the cost of retooling the entire production line to accommodate a new component would take years and tens of millions of dollars. Julian was playing a dangerous, reckless game of chicken, assuming Frank was weak, isolated, and had no other choice but to capitulate. He was putting Frank's 50-year family legacy on the brink of collapse just to boost his own profit margins for the next quarterly report for Wall Street. I called Frank. We met for coffee at a small, unassuming diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a friendly waitress who called you hun. It was the kind of place Julian Jr. wouldn't be caught dead in. Frank looked terrible. He seemed to have aged 10 years in the 6 months since I'd been gone. Dark, bruised-looking circles ringed his eyes. He told me about the constant, harassing pressure from Julian's aggressive procurement department, the sleepless nights spent worrying about how he was going to make payroll, the gut-wrenching, soul-destroying fear of having to lay off his own long-time employees, men and women he'd known his entire life, people who were like family to him. I listened patiently, letting him vent all his frustration and his fear. Then when he had finished, I laid out my proposal. "Frank," I said, my voice calm and steady, my eyes locked on his. "I want to invest in your company. This isn't a loan, it's an investment. I want to buy a 60% majority stake in Precision Components. I'll give you a cash infusion that will solve all of your cash flow problems overnight. You will remain president. You'll keep running the day-to-day operations. You'll have complete and total autonomy. All I ask for in return is a seat on the board and a say in major strategic decisions." Frank was utterly, completely stunned. He just stared at me, his coffee growing cold in his hands, his mouth slightly agape. "Arthur, where on earth did you get this kind of money?" I gave him a small, knowing, and slightly mysterious smile. "Let's just say I came into an unexpected inheritance, and as for why, I believe in your company, Frank. I believe in the quality of what you build, and I don't like to see good men being bullied." He knew exactly what I meant. He didn't even need to ask who the bully was. He saw the cold, hard fire in my eyes. We spent the next week with our respective lawyers, hammering out the intricate details of the agreement. The terms were more than fair to him. It gave him the security and the capital his family business so desperately needed to survive and thrive. And it gave me exactly what I wanted: control. With the deal signed and the funds transferred, I was now the silent, invisible majority owner of Sterling Manufacturing's most critical and vulnerable supplier. My name was nowhere on any of the public documents. The majority stake was held by the anonymous, bland-sounding Finch Holdings. To Julian Sterling Jr. and the rest of the world, absolutely nothing had changed. He was still dealing with Frank Miller, but now Frank was no longer desperate. He was no longer afraid. And the next time Julian tried to squeeze him, he was going to find that the little company he thought he could crush into submission had suddenly and mysteriously developed a spine of pure, unbending, and very expensive steel. The first, most critical piece of my intricate trap was now in place. The first move was a simple one, elegant in its beautiful and brutal directness. A week after our deal was finalized, Frank sent a registered letter to Sterling Manufacturing's procurement department. It was a polite, professional, and utterly firm letter, a masterpiece of corporate communication that we had drafted together. It informed them that, due to rising raw material costs and a new internal financing structure, Precision Components Inc. was immediately returning to its standard and customary payment terms of net 30 days, effective on all current and future invoices. It also included a modest, but completely non-negotiable, 5% price increase on all future orders to reflect the current market reality. The response from Sterling was swift, predictable, and incandescent with rage. Julian Jr. himself called Frank, bypassing all of his underlings in a fit of pique, and began screaming into the phone before Frank could even say hello. I was in Frank's office with him when the call came, sitting quietly in a comfortable chair in the corner, a silent partner to the unfolding drama. I could hear Julian's tinny, enraged, high-pitched voice crackling through the receiver from across the room. He threatened to pull the contract. He threatened to sue them into oblivion. He threatened to ruin Frank personally to make sure he never worked in this industry again. Frank, with a newfound calm and a core of steel I hadn't seen in him in years, simply held the phone a few inches from his ear and listened patiently. When Julian finally ran out of breath and sputtered into an angry silence, Frank calmly reiterated his position. "These are our new terms, Julian. They are fair, they are reasonable, and they are non-negotiable." There was a long, sputtering, disbelieving silence on the other end of the line. Julian was processing a new and completely unwelcome reality. His threats, his primary and only tool of management, were no longer working. He was a bully who had just had his victim look him calmly in the eye and refused to flinch. He didn't know how to react. He ended the call with a mumbled, incoherent threat and hung up with a loud, childish slam of the receiver. He couldn't pull the contract. He had no alternative. Halting production to find and vet a new supplier for such a critical, custom and patented component would cost him tens of millions of dollars in lost revenue and would delay his much-hyped new product launches by at least a year, maybe more. The board of directors would have his head on a platter. He was trapped and he knew it. He had no choice but to swallow his pride and his rage and accept the new terms. It was a small, tactical victory in the grand scheme of things, but it was profoundly and psychologically significant. It sent a shockwave through Julian's world. His sense of absolute control was slipping. For me, it was the first, delicious, and deeply satisfying taste of cold, calculated revenge. But I was just getting started. My next target was their largest and most important customer, a massive national distributor called National Retail Solutions. They accounted for almost 30% of Sterling's total annual revenue. I knew their CEO, a shrewd but fair man named Bill Peterson, from years of negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. Bill was old school, like me. He valued relationships and reliability above all else. And I knew from industry gossip and my own back channels that he was getting increasingly fed up with Julian's arrogance and the steady, alarming decline in Sterling's customer service since I had been forced out. Through Finch Holdings, I didn't try to buy a piece of Bill's company. That would have been too obvious, too expensive, and would have raised too many red flags. I did something much smarter, much more subtle. I bought the smaller, more agile, and highly efficient logistics company that National Retail Solutions relied on for all of their just-in-time inventory management and national distribution. Once again, I became an invisible, silent, and absolutely essential partner in their success. With this new and powerful leverage, I approached Bill Peterson directly. I offered him a deal through my newly acquired logistics company. I would give him a 10% discount on his current rates and guaranteed priority service on all his shipping and logistics needs. In a low-margin business like retail, it was an offer he simply couldn't refuse. But there was one small, seemingly innocuous condition. He had to sign a 5-year exclusivity clause with my company. To him, it seemed like a no-brainer. He was getting a better price and better service from a company that now had a vested financial interest in his continued success. He signed the contract without a moment's hesitation. What Bill didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that by signing that deal, he had inadvertently handed me a loaded, high-caliber weapon. My logistics company would now control the final, critical stage of delivery for all of Sterling Manufacturing's products being shipped to their biggest and most important client. I now had direct, powerful influence over Sterling's production through my control of precision components and its distribution through my ownership of their primary logistics firm. I was slowly, quietly, and invisibly wrapping my tentacles around Julian's entire operation, and he remained completely and blissfully oblivious. He was so busy staring at his spreadsheets and plotting his next round of efficiency layoffs that he never thought to look down at the very foundations of his business. The foundations that I now, quietly and completely, owned. The dominoes began to fall, not all at once in a great satisfying crash, but slowly one by one with agonizing precision, creating a series of escalating, baffling, and seemingly unrelated problems that all landed squarely and heavily on Julian's polished desk. Frank at Precision Components reported a sudden and unforeseen shortage of specialized alloys from our German supplier, which resulted in a slight, unavoidable delay in delivering his essential gearing mechanisms. It was only a 3-day delay, nothing that a well-run, robust company couldn't handle. But Sterling was no longer a well-run company. It was running on a fragile, brittle, just-in-time model that had no room for error, and a 3-day delay was enough to cause a cascade of expensive and chaotic production line stoppages. At the exact same time, a continent away, my newly acquired logistics company reported an unforeseen regional trucking shortage due to a wildcat strike that delayed several critical, time-sensitive shipments from Sterling's central warehouse to National Retail Solutions distribution centers. It was just a terrible, unfortunate coincidence, of course. 2 separate, unrelated problems with 2 separate business partners. But the result for Julian was unmitigated, soul-crushing chaos. He was getting furious, panicked calls from his own production manager about the line being down and his workers standing idle, and even more furious, threatening calls from Bill Peterson at National Retail, wanting to know why his store shelves were empty and why Sterling couldn't seem to meet its most basic delivery promises. Julian was hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. The production delays were costing him a fortune in idle labor, overtime costs, and missed deadlines. The shipping delays resulted in hefty, automatic penalty clauses from his ironclad contract with National Retail being triggered, wiping out his profits on those shipments entirely. His precious profit margins, the ones he had so proudly and ruthlessly boosted by squeezing his partners and firing me, were being vaporized before his very eyes. He was fighting a desperate, losing war on two fronts, completely unaware that the same calm, patient general was commanding both opposing armies. I watched it all unfold from a safe, comfortable distance, gathering daily intelligence reports from Frank and my other discreet contacts within the industry. The reports were grimly, deliciously satisfying. Julian was becoming increasingly paranoid, erratic, and unstable. He was blaming his own staff, screaming at his most senior managers in meetings, convinced that someone inside his own company was actively and maliciously sabotaging him. He never once, not for a single second, considered that the problem was external. In his arrogant, narcissistic, and fatally limited worldview, the problem had to be with his inferiors, not with the small, insignificant, and powerless business partners he had taken for granted and abused for months. The final, decisive, and beautifully timed blow came when Frank, following our agreed-upon strategy to the absolute letter, informed Julian that due to the ongoing and unpredictable global supply chain volatility, Precision Components would be forced to allocate their limited production for the foreseeable future. They could, he regretfully informed them, only guarantee 70% of Sterling's usual order for the next quarter. They were, of course, prioritizing their other, more reliable customers, the ones who had more favorable and consistent payment histories. This was the kill shot. A 70% supply of their most critical and irreplaceable component would completely cripple Sterling manufacturing. It would mean they would have to default on their massive, legally binding contract with National Retail Solutions entirely. The financial and reputational damage would be catastrophic, apocalyptic, and completely irreversible. Julian panicked. He called an emergency, unscheduled, last-minute meeting of the board of directors. He needed to explain the situation, to beg for more funding, to find some kind of solution to a problem he couldn't begin to comprehend. He was walking into that boardroom a defeated, broken man, a failure, about to plead for his corporate life. He had no idea he was walking straight into my final, elegant, and long-awaited checkmate move. The moment I had been planning for months, the culmination of all my patience, all my anger, and all my parents' quiet, powerful love was finally, blessedly here. The Sterling Manufacturing boardroom was on the top floor, a cold, glass-walled cathedral to corporate power with a commanding, panoramic view of the city. Julian stood at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, a place where his father had once commanded deep and genuine respect. His face was pale and waxy, the color of old parchment. The usual arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a sheen of desperate, cold sweat on his brow. The board members, a collection of stern-faced, silver-haired men and women in their 60s and 70s who had been appointed by his father and had watched him grow up, looked at him with undisguised, cold disappointment. He stammered through a pathetic, rambling explanation full of empty corporate jargon and thinly veiled excuses. Unforeseen market headwinds, systemic supply chain disruptions, a proactive recalibration of our strategic partnerships. He was desperately trying to sound in control, to sound like a CEO, but his voice was thin and shaking, cracking on every other word. He was a little boy playing dress-up in his father's clothes, and the suit was swallowing him whole. He requested an emergency line of credit to try and find and fast-track a new, completely unvetted supplier. One of the older board members, a formidable man named Henderson who had known me for 20 years and had always been a friend to his father, cut him off, his voice sharp and laced with contempt. "Julian, this is a catastrophe of your own making. Precision Components has been our most reliable and loyal partner for 50 years. How in God's name did you let this vital relationship deteriorate so badly?" Julian had no answer. He just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, utterly, completely speechless. At that exact moment, as if on cue from a divine playwright, there was a polite, firm knock on the boardroom door. His secretary opened it a crack, her face a mask of confusion and fear. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's a gentleman here who says he has an appointment with the board, a Mr. Arthur Finch." Every head in the room swiveled towards the door. Julian's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. "What?" he whispered, his voice cracking into a squeak. "No, get him out of here. I don't know what he's talking about. He's trespassing." But it was too late. I was already walking in. I wasn't wearing the sad, ill-fitting suit of a fired and defeated employee. I was wearing a new, perfectly tailored dark gray suit that had cost a small fortune and fit me like a second skin. I felt calm, centered, and immensely powerful. I walked slowly to the table, my footsteps the only sound in the stunned, tomb-like silence. I smiled pleasantly at the board, giving a small nod to Henderson. "Good morning, everyone. I do apologize for the intrusion. My name is Arthur Finch. Some of you may remember me." Henderson gave a slight, surprised nod, a flicker of understanding in his old, wise eyes. "Arthur, what is the meaning of this?" "I'm here to solve a problem," I said, my voice even and calm, my eyes locked directly on Julian, who was staring at me as if I were a ghost risen from the grave. "I understand you're having some significant and potentially catastrophic issues with one of your key suppliers, a company called Precision Components." Julian finally found his voice, a high-pitched, strangled shriek that was more animal than human. "Get out!" he screamed, his composure shattering into a million pieces as he pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me. "Security, get him out of my boardroom." I held up a hand, a calming, placating gesture that only seemed to infuriate him more. "That won't be necessary." I turned my attention back to the board, dismissing him completely as if he were a noisy child. "You see, the reason Sterling Manufacturing is having trouble with Precision Components is because Julian, in his infinite wisdom, has spent the last year treating them with utter and complete contempt. But things have changed. Precision Components is no longer a company you can bully." I placed my expensive leather briefcase on the table and clicked it open with a satisfyingly loud snap. I pulled out a single, neatly bound and heavily notarized document. As of 3 months ago, I announced, sliding the document across the polished table to stunned Henderson, my company, Finch Holdings, acquired a 60% controlling interest in Precision Components, Inc. I am their new chairman of the board. A collective gasp went through the room. Henderson flipped through the document, his eyes widening in stunned, dawning disbelief, but I wasn't finished. I turned my gaze back to Julian, who looked like he was about to collapse. "You taught me a very valuable lesson, Julian. You taught me that in your new, modern world, loyalty is a liability. You taught me that relationships don't matter, so I adapted. I stopped being a loyal employee and I became a smart investor." I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out another item. It was the old, faded, handwritten letter from my mother. I didn't let them read it. I just held it up for them all to see. "This," I said, my voice now filled with the quiet, righteous, and holy anger I had suppressed for so long, "is real legacy. This is real value. It's a lesson about patience, integrity, and building something that lasts. A lesson you and your expensive business school forgot to teach." I then placed the letter gently on the table, as if it were a sacred text. "I am here today to offer the board a solution. Finch Holdings will agree to restore full supply to Sterling Manufacturing, effective immediately, and even roll back the recent price increase, but on one simple and completely non-negotiable condition." I paused, letting the weight of the moment hang heavy in the air, savoring the look of pure abject terror on Julian's face. "Julian Sterling Jr. resigns as CEO, effective immediately." The room was absolutely, profoundly silent. The look on Julian's face was not anger anymore. It was the pure, abject, soul-crushing look of complete and utter defeat. I had taken his company, his power, and his pride, all without raising my voice. And I had done it using the very old-world values he had so arrogantly and foolishly told me were obsolete. The aftermath in that boardroom was swift, silent, and mercilessly efficient. Henderson, the old, formidable board member, looked from the legally airtight documents in his hands to Julian's shattered, ashen expression, then to my calm, resolute face. He didn't need any more convincing. He had seen the truth in all its brutal clarity. "Julian," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion, a judge passing sentence, "I think it's time for you to leave." There was no argument, no final, desperate, pathetic plea. Just the quiet, humiliating scraping of a chair as Julian stood up, his body hollowed out, defeated, a puppet with its strings cut. He didn't look at anyone. He walked, with the shuffling gait of a much older man, out of the boardroom he had inherited and so quickly destroyed. His empire had crumbled to dust around him. He was a CEO one moment and an unemployed, disgraced 20-something the next. The door clicked shut behind him, and it was as if a great, toxic, suffocating pressure had been released from the room. There was a collective, audible exhale from around the table, a sense of profound and overwhelming relief. Henderson looked at me, a flicker of a wry, appreciative smile on his lips. "What now, Arthur?" "Now," I said, feeling the familiar weight of 32 years of loyalty and responsibility settle back onto my shoulders, but this time it was on my own terms. "Now, we save this company. We rebuild what he tried so hard to tear down." I didn't take the CEO job myself. That was never my goal. Power for its own sake had never interested me. I wanted justice, and I had achieved it in the most complete and satisfying way imaginable. Instead, I worked with the board to appoint a new, immensely competent CEO, a brilliant woman from inside the company named Sarah Jenkins, whom Julian had consistently overlooked, undervalued, and condescended to for years. She was smart, respected, and she understood that the company's true value was, and always had been, in its people. I took a seat on the board as a major shareholder and strategic partner, the silent, guiding, and formidable power behind the throne. My first official act as a board member, my first recommendation to the new CEO, was for the immediate and unceremonious termination of Marcus Vance, the spineless HR director who had so coldly and impersonally escorted me out of the building. The new CEO, who had also been on the receiving end of Vance's cowardice, was more than happy to oblige. I heard from friends still at the company that he was walked out of the building with his personal effects in a flimsy cardboard box, the very same way I had been. Karma, I suppose, has a flair for the dramatic and a love for poetic justice. Over the next year, we worked tirelessly, side by side, to turn the company around. We rehired many of the experienced, loyal, and brilliant employees that Julian had so recklessly and foolishly fired. We mended the damaged relationships with our suppliers and customers, one honest, humble conversation at a time. We started focusing on long-term value, innovation, and quality instead of short-term profits and meaningless stock bumps. The company became a good place to work again, a place where people were valued, respected, and listened to, a place his father, Julian Sr., would have been immensely proud of. As for Julian, his downfall was complete, absolute, and total. Without the sterling name and the company's vast resources to protect him, the business world saw him for what he truly was, an arrogant, incompetent, and utterly fraudulent amateur. He tried to get other executive positions, but the story of his epic, hubristic failure at Sterling had spread like wildfire through the business community. Nobody would touch him. The last I heard, he was living off a dwindling trust fund, his reputation in tatters, a bitter and forgotten man. His son Kyle was let go shortly after his father, his meaningless and fabricated chief of innovation role dissolving as quickly and silently as it had appeared. They were a dynasty that lasted less than a single generation, a footnote in the company's long and proud history. I didn't stay on the board forever. After 2 years, once I was certain that the company was stable, thriving, and in good, capable hands, I stepped down. My work there was done. The promise I had made to a dying Julian Sr. all those years ago had been fulfilled, but my parents' incredible, life-altering legacy had given me a new and unexpected purpose. The $5 million was not just a safety net or a tool for revenge, it was a responsibility. It was a powerful tool for positive change. Sarah and I paid off our house and helped our children become completely and permanently financially independent, a gift we had never dreamed we could give them. We traveled. We saw the pyramids in Egypt, the Great Wall of China, the Serengeti, all the places we had only ever dreamed of seeing in the glossy pages of National Geographic magazines. But more importantly, we started the Finch Foundation. It is a non-profit organization dedicated to one simple, powerful mission: teaching financial literacy to working-class families, the kind of families we both came from. We run free workshops at community centers, libraries, and high schools. We teach people how to save, how to invest wisely, how to understand the quiet, relentless, beautiful power of compound interest. We teach them the simple, profound lessons my mother had taught me. We help them build their own strongboxes, their own secret shields against a world that can be cruel, unfair, and unforgiving. They tried to erase my history at that company. They tried to declare my experience, my knowledge, and my values obsolete. But they failed to understand that my history was my greatest asset. Julian saw me as old, as part of the past, as worthless. He saw loyalty as a weakness and patience as a flaw. But my parents, Henry and Clara Finch, two simple, hardworking people, knew the truth. My real value was never tied to a job title or a corner office. It was built on a foundation of integrity, patience, and love. And that kind of investment never fails. It's the only legacy that truly, deeply matters. My parents saved for me not so I could have an easy life, but so I could have a meaningful one. And I have spent every single day since trying to live up to the incredible power of that final, precious gift. Their quiet plan didn't just save me from ruin. It created a ripple of positive change that has now touched hundreds of other lives. And that is a fortune that no stock market can ever diminish, and no arrogant, foolish young man can ever take away. So that's my story. It's a story about betrayal, yes, a deep and painful one that cut me to the bone. But it's also a story about the quiet, unbreakable, and enduring power of family and the legacy that is passed down not just in money, but in wisdom, in foresight, and in love. They tried to tell me I was obsolete. They tried to throw me away like a piece of old, worn-out trash. But they couldn't take away the lessons my parents taught me, and they couldn't touch the powerful, invisible shield they had so lovingly and secretly built for me. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or cast aside by someone who only saw you as a number on a spreadsheet or a cost to be cut, I want you to share this. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their worth is not determined by their job title or their age. Their value never, ever expires. Let me know in the comments below which part of this journey you connected with the most. Was it the moment of betrayal, the discovery in the attic, or that final, satisfying confrontation in the boardroom? Your stories matter and your voices deserve to be heard. And if you want to hear more stories about how ordinary people find their extraordinary strength in the face of injustice, make sure you subscribe.